Dear Patrick, we are very glad at the CISML to have published this important volume of collected essays on the papal chancery in Avignon. It is a very original and important topic, and I would like to ask you because your research work demonstrates that scholars have been long time less attracted by the papal chancery in Avignon. Why they have been so less attracted by this topic? Do you may say why?
Yes, I think the reason is that the papacy is seen as an Italian and particularly a Roman phenomenon. So it is anomalous for the papacy to have remained outside Italy for such a long period, for decades. And I think that has meant that, in a sense, the Avignon popes were regarded as second-class popes. And another problem for the Avignon popes was that during the Great Schism, the Avignon line of popes, that is Clement VII and Benedict XIII, are now regarded as anti-popes. So that means that the whole Avignon papacy has somehow been regarded as slightly disreputable and less worthy of study than the earlier popes.
Yes, and do you may say some words on the main developments of the papal chancery in Avignon towards the time from Innocent III to Boniface VIII, yes, towards the 13th century? Are there developments, evolutions in the procedures and so on?
I think there were significant changes in the 14th century at Avignon. I think the main change is that whereas in the 13th century you have a situation where all papal documents were issued by the Chancery, in the 14th century things become much more differentiated. The biggest change, I think, is that the Pope's political and administrative correspondence, that is, the correspondence which was issued on the initiative of the Pope and the Curia, was the responsibility of the secretaries. They come in as an entirely new office, and they had no connection with the Chancery. They depended on their personal connection with the Pope. And then even within the Chancery's own sphere, you have greater differentiation in how the documents were treated. Letters of justice, which initiated judicial proceedings, were produced by a simplified procedure, whereas for letters of grace, which conferred benefits on their addressees, the procedures became more and more elaborate. So the somewhat monolithic picture that you have for the 13th century of a single institution producing the documents becomes much more complex in the 14th century.
Yes, the papal secretaries, this is an invention of the 14th century.
Yes.
They didn't exist in the 13th century. This is very interesting, and they became very prestigious in the humanistic times.
Yes.
In the 15th century in Rome.
Yes.
In your book, you explain. Pardon.
I was going to say that Petrarch was offered the post of papal secretary, yes, but he declined. Yes. But it's exactly in Petrarch's day that the office rose in importance.
Yes. In your book, you explain that the vast majority of papal letters were issued in response to petitions. And it would be very interesting to hear from you which were the reasons which motivated the petitioners, and which technical problems the Chancery had to confront.
Yes. I think the increasingly in the 14th century, the main subject of these petitions was ecclesiastical benefices. The petitioner sought to be appointed to an ecclesiastical benefice, or he sought permission to hold more than one benefice in plurality, or if he was illegitimate but of illegitimate birth, he sought permission from the Pope to be able to hold an ecclesiastical benefice. A large range of petitions dealt with that topic. And the other area which I think is increasingly important in the 14th century is what I would call spiritual favors. Petitioners asked for a license to choose a private confessor, or to have a portable altar, or to celebrate Mass before daybreak. And I think these types of graces, what I would call spiritual graces, have generally been neglected, and historians consider them to be relatively unimportant, but I think they are of great interest because they're an index of piety and the religious aspirations of the faithful at the time.
Yes, and this is very important. You have dedicated an intense research work on the original papal letters of the 14th century, which survived, even in collections, of course. Do you make even documentary evaluation of such an important phenomenon?
I think the interest of the original documents is that they have annotations which reflect the process by which they were issued. So the most common annotation of this type is the signature of the scribe. So we know from the time of Innocent III on, for most letters, which scribe wrote the letter. And through these signatures, we can trace the careers of scribes over decades in some cases. Then another example of one of these so-called chancery marks is the proctor's signature, which appears on the back of the letter. And that showed whom the letter was to be handed out to when it had been written. And that's very common from the mid-13th century onwards and continues at Avignon. And again, through these signatures, we can trace the careers of the proctors and the clients for whom they worked. And what we find is that some proctors had a very large number of clients, that they worked for clients from all over Europe. And we should see them really as operating a sort of business or firm. They weren't simply people who were sent to the Curia for a short period. They were actually established in the Curia and attracted business from all over Christendom.
Yes. You refer in your preface to two most distinguished scholars.
Yes.
You had as supervisors in Cambridge.
Yes.
Christophercini,
yes.
which I met many times at the Vatican Library in the 70s, yes. And Pierre Chaplet.
Yes.
Do you may say some words on their influence on your research work, also in respect to the future of medieval diplomatic studies?
Yes, I think Christophercini is an interesting figure for the study of the medieval papacy and particularly the papal chancery, because he was really a historian of the English church. He wasn't primarily a historian of the papacy, yes. But his work was of such high quality that it's had quite a significant influence on papal historians as well. And if you
also his wife.
Yes, and also on particularly for Innocent III, if you look at the current literature on Innocent III, it often cites Cini's work.
Yeah.
He was a very meticulous scholar, but also very original. For instance, he wrote a book on notaries public in England, which was a completely new subject. It had hardly been treated at all before he published that book that was in the early 1970s, I think. Then Pierre Chaplet was rather different, because I think he was a much more technical scholar. He was a true diplomatist. I would say Cini was really a historian with an interest in diplomatic, but Chaplet was above all a diplomatist. And I think his originality was in a comparative approach to the study of the English Royal Chancery. F.W. Maitland, the great English legal historian, said history advances by comparison, and that was Chaplet's method. He compared the kings of England with France, with the Spanish kingdoms, with the empire, and also with the papacy. And in that way, he really introduced a new way of looking at diplomacy and the documentation associated with diplomacy.
Well, in fact, both and your work, of course, now show that the diplomatic research, the research on diplomatic aspects of the production of paper letters in all the different kinds of problems are very important, or is an historical subject in itself. This is what is at the core in your book, in your volume here, published by the CISML, the Avignon Popes and their Chancery, collected essays. I would like to thank you to have given your essays to the CISML for this book and also for this interview. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And I would like to thank you and your colleagues at CISML. You've all been most helpful and supportive throughout the process.